When you're making electronic music and you're chilling in the studio, doesn't it feel nice to just have like loads of bass and to just turn up the bass and to just have all those big, round, warm frequencies washing around your ears, and it sounds so good. And then you export your music and you take it out somewhere else and you play it somewhere else, and then suddenly your music sounds woolly or muddy or somehow frustrated, and it just doesn't sound good. What's happening there is that your mix doesn't translate well outside of your studio, probably because you have too much bass. At least that's always my case. First, I'm just going to show you real quick how do I know that it has too much bass, and then what are the tools to reduce that bass. And let me tell you, it's not magic, it's fairly simple. The benefit of getting your bass under control in a sort of objective way is that while you're producing, you're not going to be seduced so much by these beautiful frequencies that only exist in your super well-rounded studio. And by relying less on those frequencies, you can craft a mix that's going to translate well in different places. And that doesn't mean that your mix has to be less warm or that your sound has to become more cold. Let me show you real quick. I was working in this little composition. So I composed this working just on laptop speakers and on a headphone. I wasn't in my studio, so I was really just thinking about the musical elements and the composition and the vibe and the mood, which is the most important part of your music, right? So I wasn't really paying attention to the sub bass, but when I would export the song and play it on little sound systems, it would be pretty clear to me that, oof, it's just sounding kind of muffled because that sub bass, that whoomp energy is trying to overtake. So now that I'm in my studio, I'm a bit like, okay, I've got my decent sound treatment and stuff. Let me actually listen to that bass and see what's going on. When I hit play here, right, what I'll usually do is I'll go to the master and I'll slap, my mastering chain is just a limiter, very simple, and I'll slap on a tonal balance. This thing. This is a plugin from Waves. No affiliation, no sponsorship, anything, right? It's just a monitoring tool that I use, and I set it to fine mode. You can do broad mode as well, and I can do fine mode. And then the idea is that your music should probably fall somewhere between these two bands, the top band and the bottom band. It's a very loose bunch of suggestions based on a lot of different tracks in a lot of different genres, but these are not bad guidelines to begin with. And you can see the big hint for me is that at the low frequencies, I'm way above, and in the high frequencies, I'm quite in the low area. So the whole thing could do with a bit of a tilt. Now, you could absolutely just throw an EQ on there and tilt it. I mean, there are tilt EQs out there. See this EQ? It just moves like this. So the whole thing just gets tilted. Let's try that. Honestly, not too bad. Look how it falls in between the lines now. This already is going to translate a lot better. Let me switch to my small speaker. Not bad at all. So that's one way of dealing with it on the master bus. And that is something that I do. I will, for example, simply use an EQ that just carves out some of the lows, and maybe a multiband compressor that only deals with that lowest octave. And so you hear me say that lowest octave, and this is one of the things that I found quite helpful to think about, is that when you think about octaves in terms of frequencies, an octave basically just means doubling the frequency of something. So 50 hertz and 100 hertz are a whole octave apart. On the piano, that's a lot of difference. That's the difference between and, or the difference between and. That's quite a big difference. So 50 and 100 are a whole octave apart, and 100 and 200 are a whole octave apart, and 200 and 400 are a whole octave apart, and then 400 and 800 are a whole octave apart. So that's 5 octaves before you get to 800 hertz. But let's even just say 4 octaves before you get to 400 hertz. That's your entire low end. That's 4 octaves worth of low end. And when you're composing, you can just think about those 4 octaves as like, how much energy do I have in each octave? Is it appropriate? Because in my example now, I think I had too much energy in the lowest 2 octaves. That's everything around 50 hertz and everything around 100 hertz. Okay, let's go back to that tonal balance. And let me just do this. Now, we're just listening to specific frequencies, right? So let me now go and have a little look at 50 hertz. So that's really that whoomp, 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 whoomp. At 100 hertz, that's more, how would you say, more chesty, I guess is the word. 200 hertz. 200 hertz definitely doesn't feel like an earthquake anymore. It just starts to feel like warmth or like mud. And 400 starts to feel really like mid-range, but low mid-range. So if you want your sounds to sound warm, 200 and 400 might be important frequencies to have. And I say frequencies, I don't necessarily mean those exact frequencies. I just mean that octave should have enough energy. Think of it like 4 buckets. How much water do you have in each bucket, right? And I just have too much water in my lowest bucket and maybe a little bit too much in my second bucket, if that makes sense. I kind of like the metaphor. Maybe I'll run with it. So you got four buckets, and let's just adjust them. And so on the master, you can just do that with an EQ, where I'm reducing the lowest frequencies kind of gradually, and then a multi-band compressor that's only compressing the lowest band. Simple enough. Now, while you're still composing, typically I try not to put too much stuff on the master, because everything else that you're going to be adding is going through that processing, and the more processing it is, the more that your brain doesn't understand what's going on. So I tend to try and keep a light touch with these ones and instead go to the individual elements. And how do we know which elements are contributing to the mess in the low end? Well, you could, for example, just solo, and then just use our ears and say, well, what do we hear? I would have expected the kick drum. We definitely hear the kick drum. But we hear a lot of other low frequencies, right? So what are they? Let me mute the kick drum and come back here. Okay. So there's a bass that goes do, 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 do. That one might be a candidate for pushing down a bit. But then there's something else adding a whole bunch of mud in the low end. It's those chords. Dom, dom. They don't really need to be here. Dom. I would want them around 200 to 400 hertz, but they seem just really loud. So what would I do? I would find them. This one. I love the character that they have in the mid-range, that kind of distorted stuff. But here, let me put a spectrum analyzer on there real quick. Okay, look, there's a lot of energy here at 100 hertz, and then over here at 200 hertz, also a lot of energy, and then a lot of overtones. Now remember, look how close a 100 and 200 are on the spectrum analyzer. Here to here, right? That's a whole octave. I don't know, that blows my mind sometimes. Like for example, if you know that the difference between 1000 and 2000 hertz is an octave, you'll be like, oh yeah, there's loads of space in between there to like be very clinical with your EQ, right? But the same goes for 100 to 200. It's that sort of granular. It blows my mind. So on this one, I don't want to change the sound quality. I don't want to change the character or the mood of the sound, right? So I'm just going to put a multi-band compressor on there that's going to take down about 3 decibels whenever it's got some low energy. And that's it. It's just going to scoop out some of those lows. How about something similar for the bass? Let me look at the bass and activate. Oh yeah. So on the bass, what I was thinking was just that around 100, it felt like a bit honky. And there was this overtone that I quite liked in the mids that I would like to bring out. So what I'm going to do is take a little bit of water out of bucket number 2, like the one at 100 hertz, and give a bit on the one of about 400 hertz, which in this case is about 330 hertz. Remember, we're talking about octaves, not about exact frequencies. Do not suddenly go out and boost 50, 100, 200, and 400. We're talking about bands, right? Frequency bands. And then the same with a little multiband, taming a little bit that one again. So that's two different tools doing pretty much the same thing. I mean, would you get drastically different results if you just use one tool twice as hard? No, really not. It's more a question of me applying one tool, listening to the final mix and thinking, I should do something more, and then using the other tool as well. One is not, I mean, it's just a bit of a habit. It's not really right or wrong. Cool. You can see here on the main synths group, again, I'm thinking in terms of octaves. So we're just taking a little bit away out of the 100 and giving a little bit to the 200. See, just like small tilts. These are very wide bells. The idea is not to be surgical with it. All right, and then let's see how it plays with the drums now. Oops. Nice. So now with those changes, we listen to the low end again. And is it nicely designed? Are the most important things prominent? I still think that the synth is a little bit too prominent here. So what can we do? We can just go back into those chords and do it more drastically. On Pro Q, I would just reduce the threshold a bit, increase the range a bit. Oh, it's a bit drastic. Okay. Scooping out some of that warm energy from the bottom to leave more space for that drum. Cool. And that's it. And now we look back at our tonal balance. And yeah, I think I could remove even a little bit more. So let's just do that on the master. Let's look. I'm kind of liking it. I don't mind being a little bit above. Push all my tools a little bit harder. Cool. So all this was a lot of little moves to just sort of tilt the whole thing a little bit by just taking those lowest frequencies and bringing them under control. And you'll see that I didn't use any like voodoo magic. I didn't use, for example, like R bass. Is that what it's called? Or is it max bass? Those ones where you like saturate your bass. Like one of the big tricks that other channels will tell you is that you want to bring up the harmonics of your bass so that you can hear it more in the mid-range. By saturating the bass, maybe saturating it in parallel. Using something like Wave's max bass or R bass, I can never tell them apart. And while that advice is valid, it's a bit too nuanced, I feel. It's a bit for like that last 5 to 10% that maybe a mixing engineer wants to do. But you as a producer, if you're a producer, all you want to do is just want to get your bass in the ballpark. Using simple tools, not using some advanced quantum physics. You just want to get the tonal balance of your song a bit right. And so just using EQ and multiband compression should be plenty, and then mute some of the elements that you do want in a particular frequency band so that you can hear the elements that shouldn't be in that frequency band so you can scoop those out. Think about your frequency bands as buckets with water in per octave, and you say, okay, are the octaves in my song more or less balanced? Should I take some energy out of one bucket and maybe give it into another bucket? This is fairly simple stuff, but sometimes this stuff is fairly simple, no matter how sensationalist we're tempted to make it for the YouTube algorithm. At the end of the day, you don't need to reinvent the wheel and you don't need quantum physics if you're just trying to make some music. So I hope you got something out of this. If you want to learn more from me in a more structured context, go follow my Foundations course. Come show us on the Discord channel what you did with this. Like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment to show me some love. And until next time, stay producing, be good to each other, and take care. Bye-bye.